The refrigerator cycled on with a throatier hum, and for a wild second, she felt grateful for the noise. The way gratitude sometimes attaches itself to the nearest moving object when it can't find anything proper to hold. She turned and found the edge of the dining table with her hip, the small, honest pain of it a mercy. She gripped the chair back until the tendons stood in her hand. She told herself she would make coffee. Coffee is an act that announces morning will come whether you deserve it or not. She measured water, and the machine sighed and lit itself with a red eye, and she wanted to laugh because the red eye looked like warning and like permission. The first drip hit the empty carafe, and she flinched at the sound because it sounded, absurdly, like punctuation. She shut the machine off mid-bloom. The silence surged back in, triumphant. Down the block a dog started in again. The short, hopeless bark of an animal who can sense a seam has moved in the world. Someone shushed it, or it shushed itself. She stood very straight and felt the fine tremor in her thighs, and made herself ride it out because the body with no place to put a tremor is a body that will run, and running was not in the script, not this version. The phone vibrated hard now. A real call, the screen blazing her first name. She watched it until it stopped. It began again, stubborn, as if belief could be made by insistence. She switched the ringer off with the heel of her palm and slid the phone into the drawer. With the birthday candles and rubber bands, and the pen that had stopped with 1 good inch of ink left in it. The night had grown thinner somehow, the way nights do when they sense dawn sniffing around the edges. The porch light looked old. She walked to the front room and peeked between the blinds and found the street unchanged, the lamppost hunched, the church lot a darker dark, the neighbor's flag breathless on its pole. For a minute she thought about stepping onto the porch and letting the air hit her like cold water. But even that felt like a statement she couldn't afford to file. She went back to the kitchen and sat in a chair with the carefulness of someone who knows chairs remember, too. The first blue ran along the baseboards, a rumor of mourning. She stood because sitting felt like guilt. She stood because standing did, too. She stood because the house had asked her a question and she didn't know the answer, and standing buys you time, even if it's the wrong kind. In the bedroom the dark shifted, and not because anything moved. The dark had begun to learn daylight, and daylight is a cruel teacher. She stepped to the doorway and put her palm flat to the wood and kept it there, until the heat of her hand and the cool of the frame made a small equilibrium, and then she took the hand away and the heat remained for a beat like the last note of a hymn. He did not come back inside. That had been the plan. Plans are faithful servants until they're asked to be anything else. She listened for the truck and heard nothing, then thought she heard it, and it was her own head assembling noises out of its parts. The clock said 2:04. She tried to remember when she had last blinked. She blinked, and the act felt manual. In the laundry room, the dryer vent trembled with the lightest breath, and a dust mote turned end over end in that stub of dawn, as if it were practicing falling. She said his name, the pastor's, once, under her breath, tasting each consonant like a difficult pill. And then she said it again, without moving her lips at all. And then she stopped saying it. There are mornings that arrive like a door opening, and others that arrive like a verdict being read. This one came on bare feet, stepped onto the tile, and looked around, and nothing in the room dared to tell it to leave. She heard the birds first, a single sharp chip that sounded like a camera flashing in a bloodless room. She put the coffee on again, and this time let it complete its work. The steam rose, and the smell filled the kitchen with a normality that had nowhere to sit down. She poured and didn't drink and poured again, as if pouring were the point. She waited for the phone to ring, and when it did not, she made it ring in her head to see if she could get used to it. The light reached the photographs and held them up to themselves. The boy with the missing front tooth grinned through the gloss. The man with his hand at his wife's waist looked like he had plans. The woman in the red dress beside him looked like she understood something about storms. She wanted to reach into the frame and turn her just a little, a quarter inch, to face the weather coming. She did not move. The clock said 5:31. The coffee went the way coffee goes when you've forgotten it in your hand. Cool. Then room temperature, then a mirror you could scry in if you believed. The first knock at the door was not frantic. It was the kind of knock people use when they don't want to wake teenagers. She didn't move because not moving is a skill people learn in marriages and in churches and in houses where bad news prefers a formal entry. The second knock had authority in it, the kind officers are trained to apply with 2 knuckles and a certainty that says we already know you're home. She walked to the door with a cup in each hand and put one down and opened the other hand and found the knob. She let the chain hang because the chain is theater. The door swung and two men in mourning and uniforms filled the porch. "Ma'am," the first one said, and she noticed he was young, and behind the youth the training had made a calm. "We received a call from." He named a person whose name moved through the air like a small boat. "We're checking on Pastor Evans." She stepped back because stepping back buys time. "He left for the airport early," she said, and the lie sounded stiff in her mouth as if it had been dried too long on a low rack. The second officer's eyes slid past her shoulder into the house, the way people's eyes do when they are deciding whether they should widen for what they might see. "Do you mind if," he began, and he didn't finish. And she didn't let him, and then she did. Because the script she had memorized did not have a line for this question. The first thing they noticed was the smell you don't name in front of a person who is still practicing denial. The second was the absence of struggle. The third was the silence that had developed a weight. She watched them cross the threshold and felt, with the fierce clarity of a person about to be found out by daylight, that the house had shifted allegiance. The younger one spoke into his shoulder, and the room answered with the sound of other men on their way. The older one asked if anyone else was home, and she shook her head too quickly and then more slowly as if correcting a math problem written by a child. When they moved down the hall, she followed 3 steps and stopped, with her hand on the wall, because people who follow too far become part of the scene in a way that requires forms. She waited. The waiting lasted every year of her life, and also 2 breaths. There is a sound a human makes when information strikes a certain chord. It is not a word, and it is not a cry. It is the noise of the body declining to be a house for the mind for a beat or 2. She heard that sound from the bedroom and knew it was the sound she would hear behind things for a long time. After that, the house filled exactly as it was designed to fill in such times. With footsteps that mean business, with the softened orders of men trying not to make a woman fall down, with the click of a radio that cannot help but be cheerful. They asked her to sit. They asked her if there was anyone she could call. She said the name of a woman from church and then realized she had said it loud enough for the room to take it. The younger officer brought a glass of water that smelled like pipes and mercy. She held it and did not drink, and then did and tasted metal, and then set it down and watched the ring it left blooming on the table like a new continent. They asked questions whose answers had elevators in them. What time did he go to sleep? What time did he plan to leave? Did he take anything with him? Did anyone know he was traveling? Had anyone been by the house? Did she hear anything unusual? Did he have enemies? Did he have guns? Did he have pills? Did he have a way of disappearing? Did she have a way of telling the truth? She answered in sentences that sounded as though someone had laid a ruler on her tongue. She did not add any of the story's weather. She kept to facts, to times, to lists, because lists had been her scaffolding, and now she needed them to hold even if the building was a SHIN. The bedroom, they moved carefully, as if to avoid waking something. They spoke in numbers and letters. They did not say the word husband or pastor or friend. They said the word victim, and it hung in the air with the authority of a stamp. The radio on one of their shoulders cracked, and the voice from it said a street name, and then another. And soon the front door allowed more men through, and then 2 women with gloves who would know how to speak to a bed without sounding cruel. A neighbor stood on the lawn in socks, his hands on his hips the way men put their hands when they are deciding whether to believe what they are seeing. Another neighbor had folded her arms and was praying into the hinge of her elbow. She realized, all at once and with no warning, that the porch light was still on and that the bulb had decided to burn out at that exact moment when she noticed it. A small surrender that felt like bad timing and also like an omen. She closed her eyes to give the sight a soft place to land. When she opened them, the light was still out.
A detective with a tired kindness in his face came to the table and sat 2 chairs away, as if distance were a courtesy that now had rules. "I'm sorry," he said, and then he asked her to tell him about last night, and she did. And the version she told was a quilt sewn of careful omissions and the kinds of details that sound like truth, because they are true even if they are not the part of the truth anyone needs most. He asked for her phone. She hesitated and then gave it because hesitating had already filled the room with enough charge. He bagged it as if it were a delicate instrument rescued from a museum fire. He told her this was procedural. He told her someone from victim services would be here soon. He told her she should drink water. He told her the boys were safe at a friend's. She had forgotten to worrying about those hours, and the forgetting made a hole that would take months to fill with any thought that could bear a name. The house began to annotate itself, small tents on small things, flags near corners, rulers beside smudges that had been fingerprints even before there was a word for them. The man with the camera moved as though every step had a metronome. He took pictures of nothing until the nothings added up to something and then kept taking them. Outside, the sun hit the steeple and made it bright in a way that would have made a person of faith feel comfort on any other morning. The two officers who had knocked first now stood on the porch and looked at the street and said very little to one another, because sometimes saying little is a way to keep a morning from becoming a story you will tell for the rest of your career. Someone no one later could agree who covered the framed family photos with a light cloth as if the pictures might take harm from looking. She stared at the cloth and thought of the veil they place over altars in Lent, and then she put her hand to her mouth and held the thought there until it dissolved into heat. By 9 the church lot had begun to receive cars that parked in haphazard angles made by grief. A deacon stood by the steps with his hands empty because he had not found a task yet. A woman with a casserole moved toward the parsonage and was turned gently away. The flag that had been breathless at dawn found wind and then lost it again. On the porch a detective said, "Lo, the word homicide," and it lifted off the boards and flew into the rooms and nested. They would find the text messages. That is what messages are for. They would make lines between times and places, and the lines would converge where lines converge when a story has been made to become a shape. They would ask her again for the hours, and then again, and each time the hour would become more crowded with her words until there was no space left for the pieces she had tried to keep standing behind her teeth. They would say the name of the man whose truck had idled and gone and returned in other nights, and she would not say it first, and then she would, and the way his name felt in her mouth would taste like the first rain on dust. For now, the morning stood in the doorway and refused to put its foot anywhere else. She sat, hands flat on the table, and the table held absolutely steady, and in that steadiness was a cruelty she could neither forgive nor do without. The detective across from her looked down at his notebook and back up, and the look he gave her was so plain with human sorrow that she had to glance away. "We're going to take care of you," he said, and the words were true in a limited way. The way sandbags are true where rivers are concerned. A car she knew pulled into the drive, and the woman she had named on the porch stepped out and moved at a pace that was both urgent and careful, like someone crossing a floor full of sleeping animals. The officers let her pass, and she came to the table and put her hand on Tonia's shoulder, and in that touch was a history no camera could make sense of. Tonia turned her face into the space between the woman's arm and side, and for a moment her body remembered something about being small and being gathered. And then the moment went, because the front door did what front doors have to do and mattered again. The town would go on swallowing this day for years, taking it in small portions like a pill you're not sure you can keep down. The boys would carry no weight in the bones of their faces that would make strangers again not know why. The sanctuary would fill and then empty and then fill with people who wanted their sorrow organized. The man with the keys to the church would stand too long with his hand on the lock, because sometimes a hand remembers before a mind can catch up. The yard would keep needing mowing. The mailbox would hold envelopes as if they contained a different fate. In the kitchen the coffee cooled. The detective rose and another took his place, and the questions resumed, gentler and no less sharp. The air had warmed, and yet the room kept a chill in its corners. She answered what she could and pretended not to understand what she could not afford to. Outside, a siren far off sang the end of someone else's morning and then laid itself down. The porch light, black to silence, hung in its bracket. The house's tired eye closed against the day. And underneath it all, steady as a heartbeat that has not yet learned it is broken, the clock kept offering seconds to anyone who would take them. The 911 call reached the Pontotoc County Dispatch just after sunrise on March 22, 2021. A woman's voice reported that Pastor David Evans, 51, had been found shot inside the parsonage of Harmony Free Will Baptist Church in Ada, Oklahoma. The caller's tone was calm at first, almost dazed, then rose sharply as she repeated that he was not breathing. Deputies arrived within minutes. The parsonage stood still against a thin morning haze, its blinds drawn. Inside, the smell of gunpowder and coffee mingled. Evans lay on his back in the bedroom, a single gunshot wound to the chest. The pistol that had fired it was nowhere in sight. Nothing in the house was overturned. Drawers were undisturbed, jewelry in plain view. It looked less like a robbery and more like a punctuation mark placed at the end of an otherwise ordinary night. Crime scene technicians began their standard sweep: photographs, measurements, gunshot residue tests, and swabs for DNA. Every indicator pointed to an execution carried out by someone who knew the layout, someone who had entered quietly, moved directly to the bedroom, fired once, and left with confidence. Tonya Evans, 47, was questioned immediately as the sole person in the house. She told deputies she had been asleep in another room and woken to the sound of the gunshot. She said she thought at first that David had shot himself. She appeared shocked, frightened, but composed enough to give short, direct answers. Investigators noted that she wore clean clothes, no visible bloodstains. They took her hands for residue testing and secured her phone. By noon, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation joined the case. They examined entry points, no sign of forced entry, and confirmed that the back door lock showed recent use. The home's alarm system had been disarmed at 1 a.m. and rearmed roughly 10 minutes later, according to digital logs. Whoever had moved through the parsonage had done so with codes. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, looking for surveillance footage or vehicles that passed during the critical hour. One neighbor's motion-activated camera captured a pickup truck pulling briefly into the alley behind the parsonage around 12:45 a.m., idling for several minutes, then leaving. The image quality was poor, but the truck appeared to be dark-colored, possibly a Dodge. When David Evans's colleagues from the church arrived, disbelief rippled through the congregation. Only a week earlier, he had preached a revival sermon in Texas and streamed messages of encouragement on social media. He was known for counseling couples, leading youth trips, officiating weddings. The idea of his murder inside the church home felt unimaginable. Investigators began reconstructing the pastor's last 48 hours. Receipts and phone records confirmed he had returned from a preaching trip to Mexico on March 20th. He spent the following day preparing his next sermon. That evening, he texted several members of the congregation, thanking them for helping organize upcoming events. Nothing in those exchanges hinted at trouble. Then detectives pulled the data from Tonya Evans's phone. What they found began to redraw the case. Hidden behind innocuous contact names were long strings of messages to a man named Callell Square, 26, of New Boston, Texas. The texts began months earlier, casual at first, then intimate, then explicit. In the days before the shooting, the tone changed again, discussions of fear, anger, and escape. The night of March 21st contained the crucial thread: messages coordinating the time David would be asleep, when the back door would be unlocked, when to come. By late evening of the first day of analysis, investigators had linked Square's phone to cell tower pings that placed him in Ada during the same window captured on the neighbor's camera. He had returned to Texas before dawn. The next morning, detectives interviewed Tonya Evans again. They told her they were reviewing communications between her and Square. At first she insisted they were only friends. When confronted with specific messages, her composure cracked. She admitted the affair, describing it as a mistake that had gotten out of control. She said Square had become jealous, that he had talked about doing something crazy. She denied asking him to kill her husband. FBI agents compared her statement with the text content. The language in those final messages was unequivocal. Instructions about the door, assurances about the alarm code, the timing of David Evans's medication. The coordination was detailed enough to constitute conspiracy. A warrant went out for Callell Square. Texas authorities located him the following day at his apartment in New Boston. When approached, he surrendered quietly. In custody, he admitted traveling to Ada but claimed Tonya had begged him to. He said she wanted freedom but was too afraid to divorce her husband because of their standing in the church. Square described parking behind the parsonage, entering through the unlocked door, walking to the bedroom, and firing once as David slept. He left immediately, discarding the handgun along the highway on his way back to Texas. Agents recovered a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson from the area he described. Ballistics matched the bullet extracted from the victim. On March 25, 2021, OSBI arrested Tonya Evans on charges of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Her booking photo circulated nationwide. A woman in a gray sweatshirt, hair pulled back, face expressionless. The arrest sent shockwaves through the church community that had spent 3 days mourning beside her. The deeper investigators looked, the more contradictions emerged. Church members described David and Tonya as devoted despite recent strain. Others mentioned tension, whispered counseling sessions, unspoken separation. Financial records showed no unusual withdrawals, but text evidence painted a clear pattern: planning, hesitation, reaffirmation, then confirmation. During formal interviews, Tonya Evans admitted she had fantasized about a future without her husband but claimed she never believed Square would act. Prosecutors disagreed. "You don't hand someone the alarm code and call it fantasy," one investigator told reporters off-record. In April 2021, both were charged in Pontotoc County District Court. Callell Square faced a count of first-degree murder. Tonya Evans faced the same count plus conspiracy. The following months unfolded through court filings and press conferences. Pastors from across the state issued statements of grief. The Harmony Free Will Baptist congregation held vigils in the sanctuary where David had preached only days earlier. Behind closed doors, investigators traced the emotional geometry of the case, the power imbalance, the secrecy, the self-deception that had metastasized into action. Square's recorded confession became the cornerstone of the state's evidence. He reenacted the path from the alley to the bedroom for investigators, identifying landmarks with clinical detachment. "She told me he'd be asleep by 1, he said in the video. "She told me to come in quiet." When prosecutors played that footage for the grand jury, the silence in the room was total. By the summer of 2021, plea negotiations began. Square's defense counsel advised him to cooperate fully in exchange for a potential reduction of the death penalty notice. Tonya Evans maintained partial denial, acknowledging the affair, denying solicitation. In October 2021, she waived extradition from Texas to Oklahoma and was formally arraigned. The court documents, later released to the public, included excerpts from her text messages. "He's taking the allergy meds now. I'll unlock the back. You have to be careful. No one can know. I can't do this anymore. It has to end." Each line, time-stamped, formed a timeline more precise than memory. Through autumn and winter the church stood half empty. Some members left entirely, unable to sit beneath the same roof. Others gathered weekly to pray for all involved. The parsonage remained sealed, crime scene tape removed but curtains closed. A vacant structure pressed between faith and infamy. In early 2022, prosecutors consolidated evidence, ballistic results, digital forensics, phone extractions, witness testimony, surveillance footage. The narrative became irrefutable, an affair born of secrecy, nurtured by fantasy, and concluded with a single gunshot in a pastor's bedroom. The courtroom itself would become the next and final stage of tension. But by the end of the investigation, the shape of the tragedy was already complete. A husband dead, a wife charged with orchestrating it, a young man facing life for pulling the trigger, and a congregation forced to reconcile faith with betrayal. When reporters asked the OSBI spokesman what motive they had ultimately settled on, he answered simply, "Desperation of different kinds for each of them." Then he walked away from the microphones, leaving the echo to stand where words could no longer add sense. By the end of spring 2021, the investigation had compressed into a single, inescapable shape. Every new report confirmed what the first responders had suspected but could not yet say aloud, that David Evans's death was not the work of a prowler or a random act, but of people he knew intimately. The formal charges on March 25, 2021. The Pontotoc County District Attorney's Office announced dual prosecutions. Callell Demi Square, 26, of New Boston, Texas, was charged with first-degree murder. Tonya Evans, 47, was charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. OSBI agents detailed the evidence. Digital records tying Square's phone to Ada's cell towers between 12 a.m. and 2 a.m. The .40 caliber handgun recovered from U.S. Highway 75, confirmed by ballistics. A series of texts between Evans and Square spelling out timing, access, and alarm codes. And surveillance video from a neighbor's security camera that caught the outline of Square's truck idling behind the parsonage, when those items were presented in the probable cause affidavit. Even seasoned reporters described the language as coldly methodical. The affidavit stated that Tonya Evans provided information about the home, advised when the victim would be sleeping, and unlocked the door prior to the shooting. Community-shocked Harmony Free Will Baptist Church had been a fixture in Ada for decades. By the time the press conference ended that afternoon, the sanctuary doors were locked and the sign out front read only, "Pray for the Evans family." Members gathered on the lawn, many crying openly. They told local television crews that the pastor had baptized their children, officiated their weddings, visited their sick parents. No one could reconcile that history with the police narrative unfolding on camera. That dissonance became the emotional core of the case, a collision between faith's public image and the private, fractures that had widened in silence. Pre-trial proceedings. Both defendants were extradited to Oklahoma within weeks. Square waived his right to contest transfer from Texas and was booked into the Pontotoc County Jail. Tonya Evans arrived separately, escorted by deputies, her wrists bound loosely with a chain that rattled as photographers shouted questions. She did not answer any of them. At arraignment, each entered a plea of not guilty. The judge ordered them held without bond pending trial, citing risk of flight and the severity of the offense. Prosecutors filed notice that they would not seek the death penalty but would pursue life without parole. Court documents released to the press filled in the background investigators had pieced together the months-long affair, the clandestine meetings in Texas and Oklahoma, the resentment that grew as the double life expanded. According to the state's timeline, the conspiracy solidified during the week of March 14th, when text messages shifted from emotional confession to logistics. In one message, Square asked, "Are you ready for me to come through?" Evans replied, "Yes, the back door will be open." The timestamp matched the alarm log to the minute. The interrogation transcription, the discovery materials were unsealed later that summer. Portions of the interrogation recordings became public. Square's confession was matter of fact. He told agents he had driven from Texas to Oklahoma late on March 21st after several phone calls with Evans. He described entering the home through the kitchen, walking to the bedroom, and firing once. He said Evans never woke up. He claimed Tonya had promised to meet him afterward but never did. Investigators pressed him on motive. Square replied that she wanted out and that she was tired of living that life. He said he loved her and believed she loved him. To prosecutors, that statement framed the killing not as spontaneous passion but as a premeditated partnership. Tonya Evans's recorded interview told a different story, hesitant, defensive, filled with partial admissions. She acknowledged the affair, confirmed that Square had visited her home previously, and admitted discussing her husband's controlling nature, but denied requesting the murder. She insisted she had given him the alarm code only so he could come over later to talk. When confronted with the full text transcripts, she lowered her head and said quietly, "I never thought he'd actually do it." The investigators stopped the recording there. Under Oklahoma law, that half sentence was as close to a confession as they needed. The legal strategy: 4 months. Both defense teams attempted to negotiate separate plea arrangements. Square's attorney conceded the shooting but argued for a life sentence, with parole eligibility in exchange for testimony against Evans. Evans's counsel positioned her as a grieving spouse manipulated by a younger lover. They pointed to her absence from the bedroom during the shooting and her immediate cooperation with police. Prosecutors rejected the notion of manipulation. They had her digital fingerprints on every preparatory act: door unlocked, code texted, time confirmed. The lead prosecutor told reporters, "The evidence doesn't show surprise. It shows coordination." The plea and sentencing in April 2022. Callell Square entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. In open court he recounted, under oath, the steps he took that night. He expressed remorse and told the judge he had thrown away 3 lives. He received life without the possibility of parole. 2 months later, facing the certainty of the same evidence and the same verdict, Tonya Evans accepted a plea agreement to first-degree murder aided and abetted. Under the deal, prosecutors withdrew the conspiracy count but preserved a life sentence recommendation. She stood before the same judge who had once watched her husband deliver invocations at county events. Her statement was brief. She admitted providing information that allowed Square to enter the house and acknowledged that her actions caused David Evans's death. The judge sentenced her to life imprisonment without parole. The courtroom remained silent until the gavel fell. Outside, church members prayed together on the courthouse steps. Some asked for justice, others still for forgiveness. Impact on the church and community harmony. Free Will Baptist Church reopened its sanctuary a month later under interim leadership. The pulpit stood draped in white fabric where Evans had last preached. The congregation chose to keep his final sermon series archived online: messages about forgiveness, endurance, and hidden sin. Each replay became a painful echo of the contradiction that had unraveled their faith-central family. Local newspapers traced the community's recovery through cautious steps. Sunday services shortened. Security lights left burning through the night. Prayer meetings focusing on the unseen battles within. Psychologists and clergy spoke about emotional isolation. In ministry families, the expectation of perfection that leaves no space for failure or confession until it erupts. Broader reflection. Forex analysts later used the Evans case in training seminars on digital evidence timelines. It demonstrated how ordinary text messages could form a map of intent, replacing eyewitnesses with data points precise to the second. Investigators from neighboring counties cited it as an example of modern domestic homicide dynamics, not driven by poverty or revenge but by secrecy collapsing under its own weight. Religious leaders across Oklahoma issued collective statements acknowledging the tragedy. One pastor summarized it: "When the appearance of holiness becomes more important than honesty, people start hiding from the very grace they preach." Present statuses of 2025. Both Tonya Evans and Cowell Square remain incarcerated in the Oklahoma Department of Corrections system, serving life sentences. David Evans's grave lies in Ada's Memorial Park Cemetery, a simple granite marker engraved with the cross and the words "Faithful Servant." The parsonage has since been sold. Its windows now reflect a new family's lights. The longtime residents still lower their voices when they pass it after dark. The Harmony Free Will Baptist congregation rebuilt slowly. Each March 22nd, members gather in quiet remembrance, lighting candles not only for their former pastor but for the cost of secrets left too long unspoken. The service ends the same way every year: a single bell, rung once, held until the sound thins and the silence after it becomes the lesson.